Sunday Politics. George Osborne called it a major success. Google say they're paying what's due. But Shadow Chancellor John McDonnell's not impressed. We'll ask him how he'd get big business to pay more tax. David Cameron says he wants an emergency brake on access to welfare benefits for EU migrants to be applied immediately after the referendum. But will that be enough for the PM to clinch a deal and head for a June vote? And will it be best for business if we stay in or we get out? We'll examine the claim and counterclaim and bring the two sides together for a debate.
Later in the programme, as the debate over the UK's relationship with the EU intensifies, what's best for Wales? The Secretary of State gives us his view.
And taking time out from their protracted negotiations with Her Majesty's Revenue and Customs over how much tax they should pay on their enormous fees, the best and the brightest political panel in the business, Nick Watt, Polly Toynbee and Janan Ganesh. They'll be tweeting throughout the programme at no extra cost. First this morning, George Osborne hailed Google's back tax bill of £130 million as a major success. Since then, the settlement's been condemned as too lenient by, among others, Boris Johnson, The Sun, Rupert Murdoch and the Labour Party, which has accused the Chancellor of offering the internet giant mates rates. In a moment, I'll be talking to Shadow Chancellor John McDonnell. First, here's Google executive Peter Barron defending the company on the Andrew Marr Show this morning.
What I would say is that in the UK we pay corporation tax at 20%. There's no sweetheart deal. It is absolutely the same corporation tax rate as everybody else. But 20% on the activities that go on.
But that's the trouble. Of what?
Yes, but you see, you keep coming back to this point about sales. We are taxed as corporation tax dictates on the activities, the economic activities of Google UK. So we pay corporation tax in the UK at 20%, and actually globally, our corporation, I beg your pardon, our effective tax rate over the last 5 years or so, round about 20%, which is very close to the UK rate and very close to the OECD average.
That was Google speaking. I'm joined now by the Shadow Chancellor John McDonnell. Welcome to the Sunday Politics. What single step would you take to make sure that companies like Google, Apple, Amazon pay a fair, appropriate level of tax?
Openness and transparency. I want them to, first of all, I want the information about how this deal was arrived at, and I want them in future to be able to publish their, the tax records, so that we can all have openness.
The British part of the tax records?
Yes, of course, yes. So that we can have openness and transparency. We can see what's fair, what's just. The Chancellor came out and said this was a major success, but we can't tell because we haven't got the information.
That's about foreign multinationals. Would you extend that to British major companies publishing their tax? We learned this morning 6 out of 10 of the UK's biggest companies are not paying any corporation tax at the moment.
Yes, I would. The suggestion has been put forward by others about the FTSE 100. I think that's a good idea. They publish their accounts anyway, and I don't see that there'd be any commercial disadvantage of them publishing their tax returns as well.
And so you think that transparency, maybe not alone, but that would be a major step forward?
I think it's one step forward, but not alone. We want country-by-country reporting as well. That's why I supported George Osborne on his negotiations in Europe on this. But
we're going to get an element of that now.
We are, but not enough. And what I found quite angry-making this morning, that we have revelations that although I was supporting George Osborne, the Conservatives were briefing their MEPs to vote against this in Europe. So I find that really frustrating. The other issue then also, I want HMRC to be properly resourced so that they can do the job. There's so many job cuts there. We've lost too much expertise. But in addition to that, there is time now to start thinking about how we review our tax system. The Treasury Select Committee is undertaking a review. That could be the start of, I think, of thinking again about how we tax companies.
Well, let's look at that, because corporation tax is levied on profits. And I think even if you got your transparency, you quickly find that the concept of profits, they can be moved around geographically, they can be manipulated depending on costs. Would you consider replacing corporation tax with, for example, a tax on corporate sales? Because revenues are less malleable than profits.
It's one of the issues to be addressed. Nigel Lawson has done an article to that effect. Others have redefined economic activity. I think that's open for discussion now.
Are you going to look at that?
We will do. But one of the most important things is to secure international agreement, because we can't have this situation where companies are shopping around the world to find the lowest tax regimes and then inventing their company structures to enable that to happen.
But if you had a tax on the revenues, it wouldn't matter what they moved around in terms of revenues are revenues, and it would be their revenues inside the UK that you would levy a tax on.
That's why it's worth looking at, and it might be a combination of that and economic activity as well.
Professor David Blanchflower, one of your economic advisors, though, he says that if you raise corporate taxes too high, companies may move to Ireland or elsewhere where they're lower. Do you accept that there has to be a limit?
There has to be a limit. There has to be some reasonableness about it. But again, if we can get international cooperation, and that's what we were seeking, you can then avoid this development of virtual tax havens that are taking place.
But would you want a common rate of corporation?
Not necessarily, but what you'd like to do is make sure that what you charge in your particular country is reasonable and fair, and you expect those companies to abide by that. I say with Google, and I listened to the Google representative this morning.
Mr. Barron.
The reputational damage to Google, I think, is immense, and I think the savings they've made in tax is not worth the reputational damage they've had.
Let's move on to the other big issue at the moment, Europe and our membership of the European Union. How did you vote in the 1975 referendum?
Against.
Against?
Against, yes.
In the 1983 Labour manifesto, it claimed that a commitment to radical socialist policies, quoting from the manifesto, was incompatible with membership of the EEC, as it was called at the time. It proposed its word, withdrawal. Did you agree with that at the time?
I did at the time, but I think that's long gone now. We're within Europe, and we're working with other socialist and social democratic parties within Europe to see how we can make Europe fair and how it can work, particularly with regard to workers' rights, employment rights, those sorts of things. And just take this issue, we need to be within Europe to ensure that we can secure those agreements about a fair tax system on companies.
But there's a lot of EU agreements that have allowed companies in the first place to move to Luxembourg, to Dublin, to Holland. These are EU rules.
But that's why, by remaining within, we've got to remain within with our own reform agenda, and that's one of the issues that we need to see reform on.
You're committed, I mean, to take that phrase, radical socialist policies, from the Michael Foot manifesto, you're committed to radical socialist policies. So how is that now compatible with remaining in the EU when it wasn't in '83?
Because we've demonstrated through the work that we have undertaken within the EU that we have secured some benefits from it in terms of a social Europe, employment rights. And in addition to that, there's real opportunities now in which we can work with others to secure that radical change. Withdraw from Europe at the moment, we think, would not be beneficial. We'd lose jobs. It would undermine a lot of the benefits we've gained from it in terms of employment, and therefore that's why we want to work with others to reform it. The issue that I've got with the Prime Minister, we'll see what he comes back with.
And I want to talk to you about that in a minute. But on the social Europe issue, I mean, you say you want a more social Europe, but in France, you've got a socialist government that's moved to the right. In Germany, you have a centre-right government. Hungary, Poland, Finland, Denmark, Sweden, Croatia, France, all right in power, or the hard right at the top of the polls. Where's your social Europe in that environment?
Well, that's why we'll work with socialist and social democratic parties across Europe, those in government and those in opposition.
But they seem to be in retreat.
Well, they are at the moment, but I think you'll see in the coming years what's happening in Europe. A wider debate is taking place. In some way, the referendum debate in this country will enable us to then look at those ideas of reform that we ought to see.
Wouldn't it not, though, be fair to say that, like Jeremy Corbyn, you're pretty lukewarm about our membership of the EU?
Well, I've signed up to remaining within the EU, but that doesn't mean to say we accept that the EU is a perfect institution. We want to see reform and we want to use it to our advantage, but we'll only do that in cooperation. And I come back to this tax issue. Unless we get international cooperation, particularly across Europe, we will not solve this problem.
But you've got a Eurosceptic track record. I mean, I'm just wondering if you've had a late change of mind. Kate Hoey, for example, who is a leading Labour Eurosceptic, she said that you and Jeremy Corbyn actually consistently voted with Eurosceptic MPs on the EU, and I think that's true, isn't it?
On a number of issues, because we were frustrated about the slow pace of reform. But that doesn't mean to say we're in favour of coming out. It doesn't. We think it's better to be within the club and argue from within, and that way you can secure that commonality of agreement across socialist and social parties.
Do you broadly support the changes that David Cameron's trying to renegotiate?
Well, I don't know what they are yet. Let's see what he comes back with. My fear is that if he doesn't treat this issue seriously, and it is just about party management within the Conservative Party, he could blow it. He could really blow this, and we could be outside of Europe and have the economic penalties as a result.
But even if he comes back with something you don't regard as satisfactory, or maybe even retrograde, you'll still campaign to stay.
Well, we'll campaign for our own reform agenda.
The government wants to get this referendum out of the way by the end of June, beginning of July at the latest. Will you cooperate on that timetable when it comes to the Commons?
We'll see what he comes back with. It looks as though they've penciled in June the 23rd. I think let's have it as soon as possible because we want the debate to take place, and delaying it I don't think would help. We want the debate to start now. That's why it would be better for him to come back now fairly soon with what he's
And
negotiated.
get the debate going?
Yes.
Even if the campaign overlaps with the important elections in Scotland, England, London, Northern Ireland, Wales, on
Well,
May the 5th?
that's the problem, but whatever time you put it to be frank, it's going to overlap with something.
Immigration is still going to be a huge issue in this referendum. The IMF says that almost 4 million immigrants will arrive in the EU between 2015, including last year, this year, and 2017. Almost 4 million. Should Britain take a fair share of that?
It's important that we cooperate with our European partners to make sure that we can accommodate those that need to come to this country. In addition to that, that we have systems in place that, for example, protect wages so that immigration is not used to undermine workers' wages.
But should we take a fair share of the 4 million?
I think we should. I think we should cooperate with others and carry the burden, because we're seeing, as in the refugee crisis, the majority of Britons want us to rise to that and ensure that we assist others and that others aren't suffering, that we don't stand on one side when people suffer.
Could you give an indication then of how many of the 4 million would be our share?
Not at this stage, no. That would be a matter for negotiating.
Even a ballpark figure?
No, that would be a matter for our negotiating with our European partners.
Should we volunteer then to be part of the EU quota system? Mrs Merkel and the Commission want 160,000 already in Greece and Italy to be relocated through Schengen. We are not part of that.
No, we're not.
Should we?
No, we're not part of Schengen.
No, but should we be part of the 160,000?
We should be. I think we should be doing more in terms of assisting refugees coming in through Syria, and we should be doing more to take, I think, those people who are in desperate need. People are drowning in the Mediterranean now.
Another 20
Another
overnight.
20. We cannot stand to that side. And this country has got a history of receiving refugees.
But I think people watching this, John McDonnell, would want some kind of idea of numbers, because numbers are important.
Well, it is important, and that's why we need negotiations very, very quickly with the other European partners and come back with practical proposals.
In 2013, you told a gathering of the People's Assembly it was a rally on immigration, that there should simply be open borders.
What I was arguing then, it was a piece of research by Rahul Gupta, who was looking at the long-term future of the globe, basically, is that inevitably in this century, we will have open borders. We're seeing it in Europe already. The movement of peoples across the globe will mean that borders are almost going to become irrelevant by the end of this century. So we should be preparing for that and explaining why people move. It's conflicts, it's because of poverty and destitution, and also climate change. In our policy making as politicians, we should be working now to see how we address that, because it will mean that we need to look at how we resolve conflicts, how we make the world more equal, and also how we tackle climate change. In that way, we can deal with the reality of the world, which means that people aren't forced to move, but there will be movement.
But total open borders? No controls?
I think at the end of this century, that's what will occur. We're seeing people ignoring borders already as they fly from Syria. So therefore, what we should be doing is making sure that there's no forced movement. We look at the push and pull factors, and we ensure that we have, as I say, conflict prevention, equality, and also policies that tackle climate change. In that way, we can cope with the global pressures that are coming with regard to population and population movement.
So to do that, then, a Labour government, to prepare for that long-term movement, I understand, would be loosening controls as you move towards a state of no
what I'm
control.
saying is that if you look at all the analysis of what's happening over the next, 75 years, this century, what will happen, the movement of people is such that borders are very difficult to maintain, and that will happen by the end of this century. We should be opening up the debate of how we handle that. And one of the issues that we have to tackle is why people are moving. And it is about conflict, it is about climate
They're also
change.
moving because they want a better life.
Well, it's about poverty as well. That means greater equality, not just within our own country, but across the globe.
Now, I wanted to talk to you this morning about Google and about the
Yes,
EU, but I hope you'll come back and give me an interview on a longer, broader discussion about economic policy. So let me finish with a taster in the hope that you do. Back to Professor Blanchflower, your advisor, one of several. He says about you and Mr. Corbyn, you will have to accept the realities of capitalism and modern markets, like it or not. No more silly stuff about companies not being able to pay dividends if they don't do X or Y. Do you accept that?
That's why I appointed Danny as one of our advisors. I want objective advice. And when he doesn't disagree with them, I'd rather he said that. And we're having open public advice. The architecture for our future development of economic policy. An economic advisory council, which includes Professor Stiglitz, Mariana Mazzucato,
no, I know
a whole
who
range
they are.
of them.
Are you going to accept his advice on that?
We'll listen to his advice and we'll take it on board. We'll listen to the advice from those range of economists that are advisors.
Well, you wouldn't want to appoint them as advisors if you weren't going to listen.
No,
I'm trying to work out if you agree with them on that.
Well, we will test. We will test every policy and instrument we put forward. On that one, let me just say to you, on that one, we're hoping that we'd avoid any need for that by introducing, as we come into government, a real living wage. But in the meantime, we want to campaign with shareholders so that they pressurise their companies to abide by a real living wage. And I think there's an alliance to be built there.
But is it party policy that if companies don't pay what you regard as a living wage until it's made mandatory, that they shouldn't be allowed to pay dividends?
It's one of the ideas that we've floated for discussion, and we've put to our economic advisors as well to give us their views, and Danny quite rightfully has given us his views.
Angela Eagles says it would be unworkable and it's not possible.
Well, that's why it's open for discussion.
So
but as I say, I think it's a really good campaigning tool for us now to work with shareholders to make sure they exert their influence to ensure their companies, on things like the living wage and actually on paying their taxes as well, make sure their companies are acting appropriately.
John McDonnell, I hope you come back and continue the debate with us.
Certainly.
Thank you. So, David Cameron once dismissed the idea of an emergency brake as inadequate. This morning, Downing Street's indicating that a brake on welfare benefits for EU migrants might be acceptable if it was applied immediately, but it would only be a stopgap measure. This evening, the Prime Minister meets EU Council President, he's called Donald Tusk, from Poland, as he tries to broker a deal ahead of a crunch summit of European leaders in the middle of next month. But will the fractious Leave campaigns, and there are several, be in any position to take advantage if the Prime Minister is seen to fail? Here's our Giles.
Right now, the future of Britain inside or outside the European Union is being decided. You might think it started here in Brussels, or that the media's massed ranks are awaiting the outcome in the European Parliament in Strasbourg, or that we're hovering with bated breath for a decision in our own Parliament. But no. This week the decision was made in Havering in Essex.
In this chamber right now, vote to leave the EU. If they do, of course nothing will change, because the smart amongst you know no council, not even the British Parliament will have that vote. We will when the referendum comes.
Nevertheless, Havering Council deliberately didn't deliberate on the leisure centre or Meals on Wheels. However, the Prime Minister, meanwhile, was hurrying for a deal on wheels, not with councillors, but 27 EU member states. It's his plan to block in-work benefits for EU migrants for 4 years that's getting the bumpiest ride. The EU counter-proposal of an emergency brake on access to benefits, if a country can prove its welfare system's under strain, has not gone down well with Eurosceptics back home.
I don't think it is a proposal. I mean, it's a bad joke. They're saying that we're allowed to go to Brussels and ask their permission to change our benefit rules, and then they'll say no. Well, we can do that at the moment.
David Cameron and knows accepting the emergency brake as is would only accelerate any campaign to leave.
We want to end the idea of something for nothing. People said that was impossible. There's now a proposal on the table. It's not good enough, it needs more work, but we are making progress.
I believe you've got to put country before party, country before personality, vote for freedom and vote for leave. Thank you.
In Havering, they aren't waiting for a date or a settlement, and the Prime Minister knows Brexit supporters are eyeing his own cabinet to see who might be tempted to do the same.
Michael Gove might come out for leave. Boris Johnson, though it's rather doubtful, might just possibly come up for leave. Theresa May, who's certainly preoccupied by immigration control, maybe. And then finally, there's Sajid Javid, the business secretary, who's got the most Eurosceptic record of all. But it is very difficult when you're a government minister and you've got real feelings of loyalty to your party and your prime minister to depart from the line. And a lot of pressure, moral pressure, if you like, put on you.
A Havering Borough MP thinks that kind of pressure is wrong.
I think that this is a decision that we all have to make from our conscience, and it shouldn't impede on people's political careers. People should be able to make up their own minds and not worry about whether they're going to be sidelined or punished as a result.
Those who do out themselves for out will need campaign wizards who can lead an official Brexit charge. Which of two battling groups that is yet is undecided. But so far both have seen a bad spell of personality clashes and darkening moods, way over the heads of most grassroots Brexiteers. The chance of winning over undeclared MPs is the magic they're looking for.
Well, we did describe it as like the Dementors slowly sucking the people up out of the body corporate, effectively. And I do think that there will be a coming together now. And probably for very good reasons. There have been divisions in the past, but I think this campaign won't be just about politicians. It's about the people versus the elite in many ways. In fact, you have a referendum, don't you, really, when the politicians can't decide what it is they want to do.
Meanwhile, back in Havering,
the United Kingdom independence is therefore carried by 30 votes to 15.
So, councillors in Havering have voted for a motion that says they would like to leave the EU. Now, there are plenty of councillors who said they don't have any business debating this. Far more important things they should be talking about. But what it might show is that for some people, and in this case an official elected body, never mind what the date is and never mind the renegotiation, they'd like to make clear their views right now.
That was Giles, and I'm joined now by the Conservative MP Steve Baker, co-chairman of Conservatives for Britain and director of the Vote Leave campaign. Welcome to the programme. Now, if the Prime Minister can get an agreement that there'll be a break on welfare payments to migrants the day after the referendum almost, isn't that a powerful thing to take to the country?
It's not a powerful thing at all to take to the country. I hope you won't mind me saying it's Bernard Jenkin who's the Conservative director of Vote Leave. But we've been told by the OBR that it would make not much difference even if the Prime Minister did get this break. And by the way, it'll only take one case brought forward by activist lawyers. And the European Court of Justice, we would expect to strike down such a measure. So we think it's a red herring. We think it's undeliverable, as John Redwood said, a bad joke. And I think that they've ended up trying to manufacture the appearance of success out of very little.
So, as things stand at the moment, there's nothing the Prime Minister is going to bring back that would make you want to stay in?
Well, I've been very clear throughout the whole period that most of us want to end the supremacy of EU law in the UK, make our own laws in our own Parliament. The Prime Minister said something very similar about the European Court of Human Rights. Of course, now much of the same substance is under the Charter of Fundamental Rights. Demanding an opt-out from the Charter is something the Prime Minister's had to give up. I mean, there are so many inconsistencies. So
the answer is no?
The answer is no. I expect at this stage a good number of colleagues to join me in campaigning to leave.
Well, how many Tory MPs are going to campaign for out?
Well, what I've always said is of the 150 who are on the list who've expressed an interest, about a fifth I've always thought had made up their minds. They've been hardening up. I would now expect between sort of 50 and 70 within that.
So no more than, you believe, 50 or to 70 Tory MPs campaigning on your side of the referendum to leave?
That would be my expectation at this stage.
Well, you and other Tory Eurosceptics, we heard John McDonnell there saying he really wanted to get this out of the way. He's not going to, it doesn't sound to me like Labour will join with the SNP on any delaying tactics for the referendum. Would you like the referendum to be later?
Well, realistically, we're campaigning now to leave the EU, and we've secured all of our objectives for this stage of the campaign. But there is a good case to be made that a June date would trespass too much on various elections in May, and I think it's very clear that the campaigns will be more ready to inform the public by September. So I think there's a good case to be made for a referendum in September.
But you would need Labour to back you on that, wouldn't you?
Well, of course we would. In the circumstances,
to get it through in the Commons.
I would prefer that the government brought forward a measure that went through the Commons without a row. But of course, if Labour and the SNP and Conservative colleagues wish to put something through, then of course we'll be able to.
What's the biggest beast from the Cabinet you hope to get on your side?
At this point, I think if any member of the Cabinet hasn't made up their mind, it's very difficult not to rule them out. So I think I'm prepared at this point to go into the campaign without any Cabinet big beasts. Obviously, it'd be a bit surprising at this point if Chris Grayling didn't declare for leave after.
Would he count as a big beast?
Well, I think he does count as a big
does?
beast. Leader of the House, given all the roles
What does
he's
a
had
little
in government.
beast look like?
Well, these are things for others to say. But, you know, people know which Cabinet members are discussed. But
Theresa May, you got any hopes on her?
well, Theresa made a speech on immigration, which is extremely difficult to reconcile with our membership of the EU. The planned ideas on benefits wouldn't touch the sides, but it really is a matter for her, and I have not had the conversation.
Given up on Boris Johnson?
Well, Boris, in the press, occasionally flirts with it, but I think that Boris is a typical Conservative. He loves Europe. He'd love the European Union to be really quite different, but when the moment comes, well, we'll just see what he does.
That sounds like you've given up. Now, we're told that the state of the Leave campaigns, to use a word, is fluid, and the fluid is blood. When are you going to stop knocking lumps out of each other and unite against the common foe?
Well, I'm not knocking lumps out of anybody, and I very much regret that this week we've had distractions from the core strategic aim of leaving the EU, and I very much regret they've erupted into the press. What I know is that everyone involved wishes to reach a resolution, everyone involved is willing to move on, and I hope we do so quickly, get designation for Vote Leave and go on and fight a winning campaign.
Now, you're not a director of Vote Leave, as I said, but you are on the Parliamentary Planning Committee for Vote Leave, so you are associated. Did you agree with the attempts to get rid of the two full-time people running it, Dominic Cummings and Matthew Elliott?
I have to say a lot of this stuff is a matter for the board, it's a matter for the people
involved. Did you
involved.
agree with whether they should go or not?
What I think is that at this stage, it's very, very late in the day to be making such a profound change. But that given the severe concerns of my colleagues, it's quite clear they're going to have to be material changes in Vote Leave in order to carry parliamentarians with the campaign.
What does material change mean?
There's going to have to be a greater degree of involvement with parliamentarians so that they feel they're meaningfully helping to shape the campaign in order to win the core vote, the core and the swing voters who we need.
Do you think you'll see a merger in the end? I think surely that's what all of you need. You're up against the government. You need to be united?
It's a David and Goliath battle. We do need to be united, but the process of unity will come through designation, because I think realistically Leave.eu is looking more at the core vote, whereas Vote Leave knows we need the swing vote to win. So there needs to be an accommodation. We need to have non-aggression. We need the two campaigns to go forward and make their case. But I'm confident that Vote Leave can and will win the referendum. I
wouldn't give away the mop just in case there's some more blood to wipe up. Steve Baker, thank you. One of David Cameron's 4 key demands in this EU renegotiation concerns competitiveness. The Prime Minister says the burden of regulation on businesses is too high and that the EU needs to strengthen the single market and accelerate trade agreements with America and China. Arguments about the economic costs or benefits of membership will form a large part of the referendum campaign, with both sides keen to attract the support of business. Those campaigning to remain within the EU say our membership is worth £3,000 to every household in Britain, though the claim is widely disputed. It's based on a CBI claim that the UK's economy is 5% bigger as a result of being in the EU. They also claim that 3 million jobs are linked to trade within the EU. Of UK exports of goods and services go to the EU, and that the value of trade with the EU is £133 billion higher than it would be if we left. Those who argue we'd be better off if we left claim that regulations imposed on business by the EU cost over £33 billion a year, though that's also disputed. They say the 3 million figure on jobs is dependent on trade with the EU, not membership, and argue that the trade would continue if we voted to leave because we currently import more than we export from the EU, so its members would want free trade to remain. They further point out that the importance of UK trade with the EU is declining, citing ONS figures showing that the proportion of UK exports heading for the EU fell from 54.8% in 1999 to 44.6% in 2014. So that's what both sides claim. But an analysis by the House of Commons Library in 2013 of numerous studies into the economic impact of EU membership found no consensus either way, positive or negative. So which side will manage to convince voters? I'm joined now by the former Trade Minister, Digby Jones, and Richard Reid, who founded Innocent Smoothies, and he's campaigning for Britain to stay in the EU. Welcome to both of you. Digby Jones, the EU accounts for 45% of our exports. Why would you risk any of that?
Well, that won't change, because in the morning after any referendum result to come out, Germany, and it's pivotal on Germany, would immediately want some form of tariff-free arrangement with Britain. They make 1 million cars they sell in Britain a year. 75–80% of all the trains you get on every day in this country are built in Dusseldorf. You know,
sure. You're assuming that, though. We don't know for sure.
No, we don't. No, absolutely right. And what is more, the moment Germany did it, the others would follow, and we would enjoy that as well. There are many arguments to stay in, and there are many arguments to come out, but the one thing that we ought to kill this canard now, is that not one job in Britain is at risk because of EU membership. Not one, because there would be a free trade agreement because we're so important to Europe. And by the way, that doesn't mean that there aren't other reasons why we might want to be in or out. But I get so frustrated with people who go, 3 million jobs are at risk if we're out of the European Union. It's rubbish.
Okay.
It's just not
one job at risk, says Digby Jones.
Well, that's a very easy thing to call as total nonsense. It's clear that biggest market is suddenly interfered with, that it won't somehow affect trade. It doesn't make sense. I mean, you know more than most people that businesses need certainty.
Yeah, sure.
What we have right now is unfettered access to the largest market in the world. The fact that we want to start playing around with this, and that's going to be good for business, it doesn't make sense.
But I don't see the added value in belonging to a club that fetters the small businesses of the country every day. If you're a big business, you can pay loads of people to sit in Brussels and argue the toss every day, and you have quite an easy ride.
It's just not the case.
It is. That is. I did it. I did it for years. Personally,
you represented it. You did. You weren't.
You were a small business.
I'm the small business person at the table.
I chair lots of small businesses now.
Yes.
And it is a pain
and I
in the
invest
bum,
in lots
Brussels.
of them. It is a colossal opportunity.
Well, of course
if
it is.
you are an entrepreneur in the UK, and it makes doing trade. Well, you're saying you're making it sound like it makes it more difficult. It makes it much easier because it's one set of regulations and 500 million consumers. If you're going to open a shop, would you want to have a shop that had 60 people walk by or 500
and by the way,
people walk by?
That is absolutely right. You can achieve that from a free trade agreement. What you get is you get the sales prevention team in Brussels marching valiantly towards 1970, trying to say this is how you will live your life, small business in Hartlepool. And by the way, the same rules will apply to 520 million people. But we all know that Southern Europe, compliance is a voluntary event. We all know that the French don't obey these rules. And then what happens is we and Northern Europe, and we're by no means the best, Scandinavia is better than us at this. We obey this stuff, and a small business who doesn't have 427 lobbyists sitting in Brussels every day arguing the case, and you know this as a small business.
I know this. We love a bit of legislation.
Okay, let Richard Reid come back.
Britain loves a bit of regulation. You're absolutely right. If we come out, and you're saying we're going to still trade, which we need to do, we will still have to comply with the regulation because that's the condition of the free trade. So we won't avoid the regulation. The regulation is there whether we're in or whether we're out. Well, when we're in, we get to influence the regulation. We get to have our voice heard.
You tell that to all the money men in the city who have seen Brussels really hammer down with regulation from Brussels.
And you see how bad it gets when we aren't there. You see how bad it gets when we are not there at the big table where the decisions are made.
So
you think we have no influence? You think we are one of the three big forces in Europe?
No, we're one of the three big economies of Europe. In fact, we become the biggest economy in
Your argument.
Hold on, I want to ask you this, Digby Jones. It seems that, I mean, you assume we will still have unfettered access to the single market. But it's been pointed out by Mr. Reid that means we'd have to meet the conditions of getting into the single market. There could be other costs. For example, free movement of people may well be a cost. That's a price Switzerland and Norway pay. It wouldn't change things.
Let us explore that, because I am very concerned that this referendum is going to become a referendum purely on immigration out in the street, when we ought to be discussing how can European Union reform improve the life of an unemployed 25-year-old in Madrid and a single mum in Athens And how can the power of Britain, economic and otherwise, commercially, business, how can it be seen as a driver to get the standard of living up? If you base your economy on exporting olives and importing BMWs, you will go bust.
Yeah.
So what they're asking Northern Europe to do is subsidise the growth of olives in the hope that for some reason unskilled people in Southern Europe will do this. Now, what you're going to get from migration, Andrew, is you're going to get unskilled people in Europe coming to rich countries instead of actually getting skilled people in Europe, marketable in Northern Europe. And you can only pull that off with reform.
Yeah,
and
but
we should not be campaigning
if we're not
to stop
inside the
these
EU,
people
we can't
coming.
do the reform.
We should not be campaigning to stop these people coming. We should be campaigning to get the skills base of Europe up so they get wealthier, but more importantly, they're more marketable in our markets. Instead of which, we stop bright Indians coming. How crass is that?
Yeah. But the British government has enough trouble getting the skills base right in Britain, never mind trying to get it right in southern
but that's reform. That's
Europe.
reform.
Richard, yeah, but if we're out, we don't reform. Richard Reid, you say that we're in the club, that we can influence the rules, but the British
Well,
has
of course
been...
they are.
But hold on, let me put the question. The British have been on the wrong end of EU majorities on these rules more than any other country that's a member of the EU. We rarely get our way on these things.
Are you joking? We have got the best possible setup. We are part of the EU, but we said no to the euro, we said no to Schengen, we said no to forced migratory targets.
So why do we lose so many majority votes?
Because what I'm saying is, let's look at the big picture. This is a macro decision. Once in a generation, we've got to get it right. The big picture is this. It is a colossal opportunity being part of. We've got the best version of the deal.
Richard, when you and I, years ago, and you were running Innocent so successfully, I was at the CBI, we were arguing cases about should we join or not the euro. And I can remember sitting in television studios and being told the world was going to end, the sun wasn't going to come up in the morning, and we were going to go to Armageddon and back if we didn't join the euro.
And no one's making that argument. We made the right decision about the euro, and we made the right decision about being in the EU.
The world isn't going to end, but this
up.
interview has come to an end. But I thank you both. The debate will go on. It's just gone 11:35. You're watching the Sunday Politics. We say goodbye to viewers in Scotland who leave us now for Sunday Politics Scotland. Coming up here in 20 minutes, we'll be hearing from our political panel. First, though, the Sunday Politics where you are.
Hello and welcome to the Sunday Politics Wales. On today's programme, our plans to devolve the rail franchises to the Welsh Government about to hit the buffers. We hear concerns about move to split control of trains running between Wales and England. And with a referendum on the UK's membership of the EU possibly just months away, I'll be asking the Welsh Secretary what's best for Wales. But first, what's next for Welsh Railways? Ministers here will be given responsibility any services from next year, but the UK government might retain control over trains that run from here into England. Now, one rail expert told us this would be a completely daft idea, while the Welsh Transport Minister says UK officials are ignorant. Now, more from her in a moment, but first, Cemlyn Davis on what's coming down the track for Welsh Railways.
It used to be so much simpler. Britain had a nationalised rail service and there were no franchises or private companies. The steam of yesteryear has now given way to a much foggier picture where borders and responsibilities are blurred. Like most routes in Wales, the Aberystwyth to Birmingham International Line is part of the Wales and Borders rail franchise, which will soon become the Welsh Government's responsibility. But it seems the map could be very different and much smaller by the time that happens.
There is a suggestion now that services like this one, starting in Wales but ending in England, could be broken up, with different companies providing the service either side of Offa's Dyke, and that could leave passengers travelling to Birmingham from Aberystwyth having to change at a station near the border.
It's a very bad suggestion, especially for people going to Birmingham International Airport, which is people from university, hospital, travelling a lot, going to Europe or abroad. So it's very inconvenient.
I'm going to Manchester. I have to change over in Shrewsbury anyway. It's only about 25 minutes, maybe half an hour journey, change over anyway. So it's just the best option for me, really.
I remember the sunny days when you could get a train to Aberystwyth once a day or all the way to London. long gone. What a shame.
This worries us greatly. Most of the passengers go as far as Shrewsbury, about 75%, and about 50% of passengers are actually going beyond Shrewsbury to mostly Birmingham, Birmingham International, or of course London, which is a major destination.
The UK government has said it expects that services primarily be remapped and taken out of the Wales and Borders franchise to ensure proper accountability. The Welsh Government, meanwhile, has launched a consultation into the future of the Wales and Borders franchise, and though the document makes no reference to any possible redrawing of the rail network, Carwyn Jones did have this to say in the Senedd.
It is the suggestion of the Department for Transport that they do not want to see rail services exist between a departure point in Wales and a terminus point in England, and vice versa. We're more than happy to make that case to the UK government, but it's important to understand that that is the attitude that's been taken so far by the Department for Transport.
As well as the Aberystwyth to Birmingham line, there are questions over the future of the Milford Haven to Manchester service and the route between Holyhead and Manchester and Wrexham and Bidston. Despite running through England, it's understood the Cardiff to Holyhead line wouldn't be affected because that journey begins and ends in Wales. And neither would the routes between London and Swansea or Holyhead because they're part of separate franchises. The suggestion has baffled industry experts, including Christian Wolmar. The transport journalist, who does have strong Labour ties, has written extensively about the British railway system.
Well, I think this is a completely daft idea. It's the sort of thing that has arisen out of the fact that the railway is privatised. So the English government seems to be worried that the Welsh government would have control of, say, a train that ran from Aberystwyth to Birmingham, and that in the English part of it, the Welsh government would be running it and therefore might determine things like the timetable and the services and so on. I think that's a completely ridiculous notion, and hopefully pressure will stop it.
The UK government says it's working closely with Welsh ministers, and no decision will be made without taking local views into account. The strength of opposition to any change is already clear.
It's ludicrous, it's impractical, it's being done behind the scenes with a lot of secrecy initially anyway, and we're determined to fight it. It's not in the interest of passengers. People hate changing trains. It's a deterrent. It would affect the tourist industry.
This train left Aberystwyth on time for its journey through mid-Wales and into England, but it's unclear how far it will be allowed to travel in the future.
What exactly is going on? Well, our reporter Carl Roberts caught up with the Transport Minister in Swansea. Edwina Hart is standing down in a few weeks, of course, after a ministerial career where she's been known for her combative style. Carl asked Mrs Hart for her take on this situation.
Well, we understand that some of this has been mooted in discussions at official level, and obviously we're very unhappy about that because we want to ensure that those services remain within the franchise. It makes it a very value added in terms of the franchise. So obviously we will be pressing our case to ensure that the franchise arrangements include all the cross-border.
What do you think the motivation is for these suggestions? Why are these things being discussed from a Department of Transport point of view, do you think? Some people say it could be to sabotage any franchise and make it less appealing to anybody who might want to bid for it.
Yes, I think people do try and say things, that there's conspiracy theories. I sometimes think that some of the people that you deal with don't actually understand Wales, and they don't understand how things work and what are important.
Do you mean the UK government now?
And I mean sometimes there are officials at various levels within DFT, but I have to say at the end of the day, my job is to ensure we have the best services and the best franchise, and that's not the right way to go ahead. I'm quite charitable. I base some of their comments on ignorance rather than conspiracy theory.
You've said in the past that any future franchise, you think that the people of Wales would like to see rail services in Wales nationalised. You say that's what the people of Wales think. What do you think?
Well, I don't think I've used the word nationalised in that
Brought
way.
into public ownership.
That is, there's much more accountability for the public, which I think there will be when we look at how we might set things up in the future. Because I don't think it's been really well run in terms of what happens now with rail. We have all the problems with Network Rail, which are very real to us in Wales. Projects overrunning, costs overrunning, and you have no control of Network Rail, really, because they're judged during execution in terms of what they do.
But can you foresee a situation where the Welsh Government would be running those services, perhaps with an arm's length company doing the running for you, but they're firmly managed and run essentially responsibility-wise with the Welsh Government?
Yes, and I do see that as being the future, and we've got a lot of support for looking at these issues like this, because we've already indicated what we do with the metro service and everything, and that's very important. That they'd actually have a good input into then what is happening, because there's such a lot going on in terms of transport. You've got the franchise discussions, we've got all the issues about electrification, and you know, on electrification there's great disappointment about electrification where we are now in Swansea, because they really wanted to be part of the electrification straight through. They're not. They've gone to a different control period. They're worried it might never happen, and the impact then further west of electrification doesn't come to Swansea. So people do want to feel that there's a government fighting for them that has more control over things.
We ask people about you and the kind of person that you are, the kind of minister that you are. They say you're a doer, you make decisions, you get things done. Is it a regret that by the time you leave office that there's still the future of any new M4 relief road is still up in the air?
No, I think we've gone through a process with the M4 relief road. I think there's a lot of hot air around the M4 relief road. At the end of the day, we'll end up with a public inquiry. We've got all the environmental considerations, and that's the timescale we're in, our decisions. I think when you leave politics, there will always be things that you'd like to have been there, but that means you'd have to carry on, you know, and live long enough to do it till you're about 120, 130. And I'm not one of those politicians that think you have to that things look into when you're not there. I think in public life there'd be too many that have thought that. And
the final question from me, if you're not on a train going from Swansea to London, do you think you'll be driving down a new M4 anytime soon?
Well, I would very much hope that we can proceed with the project. We're very committed to the project, but obviously there are other hurdles to go through. There will be a public inquiry and everything. But I know one thing, that I would be retired. But there's a lot of people that require that for work, and the CBI and all of them are very strong behind the need to ensure that we have economic prosperity, and they regard that as being a key issue, is the development of the new M4.
Thank you for your time.
Now, it's possible that we're less than 6 months away from a referendum on whether the UK should remain in or leave the European Union. Now, David Cameron wants to apply a so-called emergency brake on the ability of EU migrants to receive in-work benefits for 4 years. And he wants to apply that brake the day after a referendum. Now, there's an important meeting tonight at Downing Street, and if Mr Cameron gets his own way, the vote could take place in June. Now, in a moment, we'll discuss this with one person who wants to leave and another who wants to remain.
In Wales, we've already had some of the issues debated when Carwyn Jones went head-to-head with Nigel Farage earlier this month. Last week, the Secretary of State for Wales, Stephen Crabb, set out his stall as being in favour of staying in if David Cameron gets the changes he wants. So, when I met him, I asked him if there were any circumstances where he would not back the Prime Minister.
Well, we're going into this renegotiation process with confidence that we can get a deal. And if you look at the track record of the Prime Minister, even when every other commentator has been predicting that he wouldn't be able to get reform in Europe, whether we're talking about securing the rebate or getting a real terms reduction in the European Union budget, he achieved that. So we've got confidence that he can get a good deal from this renegotiation. I've got confidence in that, which is why I'm confident that when the time of the referendum comes, when we get that successful renegotiation, I can go out as Secretary of State for Wales and campaign on a strong and pragmatic case for Wales and Britain to remain inside a reformed EU.
But what we don't have yet is the exact meaning of what a good deal would be. For example, on migration.
The proposal for a 4-year period before which European migrants would be able to claim in-work benefits, that proposal is still on the table. That proposal is still being discussed with our European partners. Now, if our European partners come back to us and say, look, there's another way that we can help you achieve the same objective, and let's recognise what the broad objective is, which is to reduce the pull factor of welfare policy increasing immigration into the UK. Of course, we want skills, we want talent to come to Wales and to come to Britain. What we don't want is our welfare policies providing that additional pull. Now, the European member states, the other member states, know this is a difficult area, but they get where we're coming from, and although it's painstaking, it is difficult discussions, I'm confident that they'll see sense and help us reach a deal on this.
When it comes to the campaign itself, whenever that might be, I mean, do you think there needs to be a different emphasis on the campaign in Wales, considering Wales is the only part, or areas of Wales are the only part of the UK receiving these additional EU grants and funding? Does that, for you, sway how the debate should be held in Wales?
The point that I'm making in this speech is that this should be about weighing up the risks and opportunities of both options, either staying in or coming out of a reformed EU. And of course, in Wales, where we have issues like of greater than average proportion of farming subsidies and structural payments like Objective 1, those are clearly factors that we need to take into account. What I don't like is to see the debate in Wales simply focus on those issues, which is the traditional evidence and arguments that politicians in Wales tend to use to back up this kind of unthinking stay in the European Union at any cost approach. That's what I'm rejecting. I'm saying, look, we need a bit more of a considered approach, one that actually looks at the risks and the opportunities, weighs it up. It's a hard-headed, pragmatic look at the evidence, and in Wales we've got particular issues that are important.
But the hard-headed, pragmatic look on it will be, over the last 7 or 8 years, £1 billion or so of structural funds has come into Wales from the EU coffers. Now, the Leave side will say, well, that's money, it's British money, it could come to Wales anyway. But it's a risk, isn't it? And that's why I'm asking, do you think that element should form part of the debate in Wales?
So this referendum that we're going to have in the next year or so, this will be a once-in-a-generation decision. Now, it's a decision for the long term. Now, we shouldn't be making arguments for the long term based on the fact that we're getting temporary payments from the European Union because of economic failure in Wales. Objective 1 is not an accolade for Wales. We should be aiming and working and do everything we possibly can to be rid of that European money, because that's actually a mark of economic failure, not a mark of success. So let's weigh up the pros and cons. We'll take into account all of these different issues, structural funds, farming payments, and all around. But let's set our ambitions higher. Our ambition should be for Wales to be punching well above its weight within the European economy rather than trailing behind.
You'll be aware of this letter that's been sent by Carwyn Jones and the leaders of all 4 political parties in the Assembly, as well as the views of Nicola Sturgeon, which is that the referendum shouldn't be held too close to the Assembly and the local elections, which would rule out a June referendum. Can I ask, what's your view on that?
Well, I was really surprised that Carwyn Jones put his name to that letter, given that it was Carwyn Jones who kicked off his own Assembly campaign at the start of this year with a head-to-head debate against Nigel Farage on the question of Europe. So I think he's trying to have it both ways. Look, they all made the case last year that they shouldn't have the referendum on the same day as the elections to the Welsh Assembly and the Scottish Parliament. We listened to that. I happen to believe that there's no great problem in combining elections and on a particular day, but we listened to the arguments and we made a commitment not to have it on the same day. So they said, thank you very much. Now they've moved the goalpost and say, well, we don't want the referendum happening within a number of months or weeks of the Assembly and the Scottish Parliament election. So I think there's a bit of silliness going on here. I think people in Wales are well able to handle debates about different issues in roughly the same time period. And I think it will be a good debate when it comes.
Stephen Crabb there. Well, I'm joined now to chew over some of those points by Lynette Parrott, who speaks for Europe for the Lib Dems in Wales, and Sam Gould from UKIP. Thank you both very much for coming in.
You're welcome.
This morning. Lynette Parrott, just to start off with you, if I may. I mean, these changes, these proposals that David Cameron wants to see to limit the in-work benefits for EU migrants for 4 years from the point where they reach here. What does that make to you? Does that sort of make the EU a less attractive sort of policy now for you?
Not at all. I think that regardless of the package of changes that David Cameron is hoping to achieve on a pragmatic basis, the long-term picture for Europe is one of partnership with our nations. It's about making sure that we have, looking to the long term, the economic opportunities to help collaborate together across Europe to fight against the threat of jobs being lost to the Far East. It's about tackling climate change, again, over the long term. It's about those international relationships that we've developed as a partnership of nations for a long period of time, and that have helped to bring us security and stability.
Well, OK, Sam Gold, I mean, I don't think for a second what David Cameron achieves will sway either of you two, but do you think for the British voters, maybe, if he can come back and say he's got a good deal on, or for example, benefits here, that might sway some of the sort of uncertain voters?
I think that voters will actually see through the smoke and mirrors that's been created by David Cameron. I don't think in any way he's going to get a good deal. And that you just look at this emergency brake on migration. Well, all it's doing is basically asking, allowing him to go back to Brussels and actually request for us to then have a break on migration. It's not giving him any real power. The fact that he has to go around Europe and around the different states begging for his own right to actually change his own laws is not a leader of an independent nation.
Eluned Powys, what do you think of this idea that he wants the emergency brake, if he gets it, to come into place the day after a referendum, and then it'll be in place, he wants to say, for 7 years while they work on a more permanent fixture? Doesn't that undermine one of the key sort of plus points for the Remain side, which is that certainty that you know what you'll get after a vote to remain in the EU, but actually we don't really, do we? Because it'll just be tinkering again if the UK remains.
Not at all. Over a period of time, obviously, as the challenges facing Europe change, there will be changes that are negotiated between the European states. But of course, those are decisions for the European Parliament and our elected heads of states as part of the Council of Europe too. There are inevitably going to be different crises that approach Europe, and we will need to take those into account and deal with them as they arise. But what I'm talking about is those long-term challenges that remain constant. Climate change, making sure that we are economically resilient and that we can the swings and fortunes of the global market, and also things along the lines like making sure that we've got research and development in our universities, investment going there, and making sure as well that we've got, through things like the Common Agricultural Policy, a stable food base and farms that are able to survive without it.
I guess that's a good point, isn't it? For the Remain side, you can list off a whole lot of attractive things that EU brings. From the Leave side, there is a danger that actually it's an awful lot of uncertainty when you're looking at things, for example, like trade and so on. Is that a concern for the Leave side?
Not at all. I think there's actually more uncertainty if we remain. You just look at the case of Welsh Steel, for example, and the uncertainty that's been there. In fact, we've lost hundreds of jobs recently as a result of the EU doing absolutely nothing. And the fact is, if when we get our own control once again over the UK markets, we can then ensure that we can actually protect British jobs first.
But OK, that's the steel industry, but there are an awful lot of other issues surrounding it, whereby trade, for example, with the European Union, a huge amount of exports from the UK out to the EU countries, and you'd have to sort of renegotiate all those different factors without knowing exactly what the end point would be.
Look, the EU will negotiate and offer a free trade deal, I'm sure, within 24 hours of us leaving.
You're sure, but that's not cast iron. I'm sorry, I've got to pick you up there. That's not cast iron, is it? That's your
Under World Trade Organisation rules, that would have to remain. Furthermore, as well, we'll regain our seat on the World Trade Organisation, therefore enabling us to make our own trade arrangements. The fact is that the EU hasn't made trade arrangements with the United States of America or China, some of the biggest markets in the world. We'll be able to do that as an independent nation. Furthermore, we import billions of pounds worth of products from the EU. We import more than we actually export to it. It's in their interest to ensure that we have a free trade arrangement with them.
There we are. It makes the freedom far easier for trade.
Forgive me, but that's absolute nonsense. Of course, the European Union at the moment are undergoing those negotiations over a union with America to free up trade. But it's an absolute nonsense. 44% of Britain's trade goes to European nations. Those emerging, developing countries, that's less than 10%, about 8% according to latest figures. It would be absolutely devastating to the British economy and to Wales in particular if people who have come and invested in Wales, those inward investors that we've brought here over generations, decided all of a sudden that they would have to leave because the reason they came here is it was an entry point to the European market. The European market is 500 million consumers. £1 in value. I'm sorry, but the UK market as an entry point is nowhere near as attractive.
And I guess on a separate issue, but to pick up on what Stephen Crabb was saying in the interview there, does it need to be a different emphasis in Wales when you consider the billions of pounds over the last 10 years or so that have come from EU structural Objective 1 funds? Now, I've heard the argument before, well, it's British money, we'll just give it to Wales anyway. But again, that's not a guarantee, that's an uncertainty.
Well, there's uncertainty. The fact that when the European Union is growing is the fact that when Turkey joins the European Union, you know, Stephen Crabb is more than aware that the funding coming to Wales will then also will decrease. There's far more certainty when we leave the EU and we'll have to take control of our funds. Just as was mentioned as well in terms of trade negotiations, the Transatlantic Trade Initiative Partnership, TTIP, being negotiated in secret by the European Commission in regards to a trade agreement with the United States, puts many of our things here in Wales at risk. It puts the NHS at risk and could lead to privatisation of the NHS, which we want to stop.
Actually, that's not true. It's your policy in the UK as UKIP to scrap the NHS, so I'm afraid that that's not really a very...
That's completely not the case. Sorry, it's an interesting point that we'll return to again over the few months, but...
Thank you.
You can get all the latest on Twitter. We're at Wales Politics, but for now, that's all from me. Diolch am wylio. Thanks for watching. Time to go back to Andrew.
Welcome back. Let's return to the issue of internet giant Google's tax bill. Of course, it's not just Google. We'll come on to that. But earlier in the programme, I spoke to Shadow Chancellor John McDonnell. I asked him what would he do to make sure that companies like Google pay a fair and appropriate level of tax.
First of all, I want the information about how this deal was arrived at, and I want them in future to be able to publish their, well, the tax records, so that we can all have openness.
The British part of the tax records.
Yes, of course, yes. So that we can have openness and transparency. We can see what's fair, what's just. The Chancellor came out and said this was a major success, but we can't tell because we haven't got the information.
John McDonnell speaking to me earlier. Jen, and I would suggest that the Google row rumbles on, helped by Google appearing with Andrew Marr this morning. There are other companies in the frame similar to Google, like Amazon, Apple, big investigation by the European Commission into their tax bill. And we discover that a lot of major British multinationals don't pay any or very small amounts of corporation tax. This issue has got a lot, I would suggest.
Yeah, and it could end up in a transatlantic, almost Cold War between the EU and the US, and in particular US companies, because each side thinks the other's trying to exploit its side disproportionately. And I wondered that whether eventually the people who will ultimately lobby for international corporate tax reform and clarity will be corporations themselves, because at the moment they're getting into trouble for what is ultimately observing the letter of the law and certainly observing their fiduciary duty to pay the legal minimum of tax, the duty they have to their shareholders. If that's getting them into trouble, then I think they have an incentive in the long term to press for clarity and reform internationally, even if it means their aggregate tax payment goes slightly upwards.
The irony is that this row comes after there's been major changes at the OECD level, at the EU level, on trying to simplify and get multinationals to pay their due tax. And yet we seem to be no further forward than before, despite all that. I wonder whether people are going to start looking hard at whether corporation tax itself is the right way to proceed.
I think there are other ways of doing it. It's true, you can do it on sales, you can do it on turnover. But what's quite plain is that these large companies that are taking bigger and bigger slabs of the British market, of British markets, are not paying their tax. And one way or other, they have to. Think of the people who are competing against Amazon. You know, whether you're Argos or whether you're John Lewis or
the local bookshop.
Or the local bookshop. It is just not fair. And I think their sense of indignation, and then to discover that the Conservative Party, while talking about this government, while talking about how they're trying to clean this up and they're doing more than Labour, which possibly they are, meanwhile instructing their MEPs to vote against moves in Europe, to try to get a proper European agreement on this. It's not going to work unless we get a European agreement. And to find out that the government says one thing speaking here, but secretly in the European Parliament does something else. I think there's a lot of legs in this. I think a lot of trouble for the Conservative Party because it plays to their weakness, just as security and defence plays to Labour's weakness. This plays to a core weakness. They're in bed with the big corporations, and they don't really want to.
Do you think they are in bed with them, though? I mean, there's no evidence that they've had all these meetings. Politicians love meetings. So-called cutting-edge companies. They don't spend that much time with steel companies, but they'll spend it with Google and Apple and all the rest. It's a bit of a stretch to then think that they were ever doing anything about Google's tax return at these meetings.
I think it's quite a stretch. It's been right, you know, Steve Hilton, married to Google top executive, right at the heart of Downing Street, just as Andy Coulson from the Murdoch Empire was right at the heart of Downing Street. I think this is very risky.
Seamus Milne at the heart of the Corbyn Empire.
Well, indeed, but they're not actually in power. There's quite a difference
no, they're not.
between being in power and
but they
not
want
in
to be.
power.
But they,
well, a lot of people want to be.
It is ironic that after the international rules were meant to be cleaned up, they were meant to have done something about the double Irish and the Dutch sandwich. I speak in tongues because that's how you have to do it these days. But they haven't been, and it will take, unless there's a major radical change, I would suggest, if they carry on the current way, it'll be another 10 years before there are further changes that solve this issue.
Yes, and not only were the international rules meant to be cleared up, George Osborne, almost every budget he stands up crackdown on tax evasion, but talked about how reprehensible aggressive tax avoidance is, talking very, very strongly, and then last week says that this deal with Google is a special deal. I think the problem for George Osborne, he's sort of forgotten the second part of Peter Mandelson's famous sentence, which is we're very relaxed about people getting very, very rich, ... as long as they pay their tax.
Yes.
And he sort of forgot about that. And I think the problem for George Osborne is that he sees everything through a sort of a 2010 lens. And the 2010 lens is, well, this deal is much better than anything that happened under New Labour. But the thing is, that's 6 years ago. We've moved on from that.
And governments were finding their way against companies like Google.
Exactly, and people are now judging this government on what they've done, and it looks inadequate.
And it's been a long, slow burger campaign. If you think of the tax justice campaign, it's been brilliant. UK Uncut ran fantastic demonstrations, clever, witty, sharp, against Topshop, against Vodafone, against Boots, people who are avoiding their taxes in elaborate ways. And by witty campaigns that the public saw, it's coming.
Is at the centre of it now, and as I say, with other cases coming up, Apple and Amazon, Vodafone is always in the frame for these things, all using European low tax. Just finally on this, I thought it was fascinating that Peter Barron of Google this morning explained, in effect, that the money that's made in Britain and other places is then sent to Bermuda, essentially warehoused in Bermuda. Why? Well, Bermuda's a tax haven, but if they repatriated it back to Californian headquarters, they'd pay corporation tax in America, and they think that's too high.
Well,
So all the governments are suffering from this.
Well, American corporate tax, if you add in every single level, I think is around about 40%, which is why Apple have about $200 billion in cash reserves internationally.
They've all got it outside. All right, let's move on the referendum. I know we're going to be talking about this a lot. I got the impression, again, from listening to John McDonnell and other Labour shadow ministers I've interviewed, that actually there is no appetite, I don't think, on the Labour front bench to delay this referendum. I think they would like just to get on with it.
They want to get on with it. They want it to succeed. They want the Yes campaign to win. At the moment, Labour's not doing very well with it because it ought to be a great sort of hallmark for them, apart from one or two very fringy people, almost unequivocally pro-EU. And they should be making a lot of capital against a very split Tory party. And they're not really.
Well,
it isn't quite clear why.
Maybe their hearts are not in it. After all, it's led by two people who voted to come out in 75.
I don't think it is just that, because they've got Alan Johnson leading the Labour campaign, and he doesn't really seem to be making much headway. I mean, maybe they're just waiting till Cameron comes back with a package, but I think they're missing a trick here.
You see, Steve Baker this morning said that he wanted it later. The Eurosceptics want more time. They fear if it's rushed in, they're definitely going to lose. But to stop a June referendum in the Commons, It would need, the Scottish Nationalists are up for a fight in this, but it would need Labour too. If you don't have Labour, the government gets it through.
Yeah, so, I mean, it's clearly not going to happen. I mean, the only thing I think that could stop it, because the numbers there are now not in the Commons, is if the Electoral Commission, bearing in mind that you've now got the leaders of the three devolved administrations, Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland, saying they're not happy with the June referendum because it's so close to their elections in May. That's the only thing that could potentially stop it. But now that we should get on with it, then it looks like that will happen. And I mean, obviously, people like Steve Baker need to be careful because they have been saying for 20 years we need to have a referendum.
Bring it on.
Here it is coming down the stream and they're saying, oh, we're not sure about it, which potentially shows that they're nervous about the case that they want to make.
I thought the most telling thing Steve Baker said was that the number of Tory MPs who will vote to leave, I think, would be no more than 70 he was budgeting for, which is clearly expectations management on his part. And what you've seen over the past 72 hours is expectations management by both sides. So number 10 talking about this emergency brake on benefits that's clearly a bit less than they expect to extract in the summit in the middle of February. So now they're dampening down expectations. They come in slightly above, and we're all massively impressed when it happens.
I hope you're right that he's that clever. What worries me is that he's been very reckless in these negotiations, has put things out there that he could never get, has not got everybody squared before suggesting things. I hope you're right.
If not clever, then certainly cynical. And on the other side, on the outside, Steve Baker and the sceptics are clearly playing down their expected numbers as to the number of Tory MPs, even cabinet ministers, who will eventually vote.
But it's interesting for George Osborne, the area where he thinks you will make the most fundamental and important change are the protections for those countries that are not in the Eurozone to ensure that they can't be out-caucused in the rules on the single market.
And that's
by
a
the
very
Eurozone.
little coverage.
And that gets very, and George Osborne says that is the most important thing we could get because it'll play for decades. But the territory that they're fighting on is the area where they're quite weak, which are potentially these benefit reforms.
Because we'll have another referendum, probably 2021, won't we, when treaty change takes place and the Eurozone becomes a proper monetary union?
I don't think anybody's going to do any treaty change for a very long time. The mood right across Europe, for a whole lot of different fractious reasons, but particularly about immigration and refugees. I think nobody will want a treaty. It's all big talk.
Even after
anybody
the French
says,
and German elections?
No, I don't see it, because I don't think anybody will trust their own electorate sufficiently at any particular point. They'll look at ours with great interest.
And they'd say, don't go there.
And I think say, don't go there.
I think you're probably right. Now, before we go, a sad morning today because we learned that the veteran broadcaster Terry Wogan has died at the age of 77 after a short battle with cancer. Over his many years in broadcasting, he'd interviewed a great number of people, including, of course, politicians too. Here he is talking to Margaret Thatcher back in 1990.
And what do the next 10 years hold for us and for our Prime Minister? Mrs. Margaret Thatcher. Are you ever apprehensive before you get up and speak?
Always. And you wouldn't speak well if you weren't. I've been answering questions in the House every Tuesday and Thursday for 10 years when the House is in session. I'm still just as nervous as I was at the beginning. It requires immense preparation.
You've seen your share of trouble and strife and success, triumph. What have been your worst moments?
Oh, the worst moment, undoubtedly, was when the Argentinians invaded the Falkland Islands. I will never forget it.
With the worries and some of the terrible moments that you've had,
Oh,
and
they
some
were
of
dreadful.
some of the proud moments, do you have any time for what everybody has, for personal worries?
We've been very lucky. You know Dennis very well. Yes. You both belong to Lord's Taverners. Well, everyone knows Dennis. He's marvellous. Everyone knows Dennis. He's lovely.
Why did our audience laugh when you mentioned
because he's regarded in great affection by everyone, because he has a tremendous knack of saying things that people would love to say but daren't.
Terry Wogan talking to Margaret Thatcher, one of the most accomplished and professional, charming broadcasters in modern times. Sadly, died this morning, we learned from his family. Terry Wogan. That's it for today. I thank all of my guests who were on. The Daily Politics will be on at BBC 2 from noon tomorrow and every day next week, including Prime Minister's on Wednesday. I'll be back here, same time, same place next week. We'll know more about the American election campaign by then. Remember, if it's Sunday, it is the Sunday Politics.